Going Down, written by Jacob Cordtz and read by Bob Reiff. On a brown and beige chessboard floor, James stood tall in front of an ornate vintage mirror. The mirror covered the length of the sixth-floor foyer. He grinned proudly at the player reflected back at him. He glanced over at a marble shelf. Below the antique clock, beside the vase of plastic roses, sat a bust of Eros, to which he asked, "How was your night? Was it as good as mine?" He looked at his phone. It was nearing 4:30 in the morning, and he knew he'd better get moving if he wanted to keep up his facade. In his inbox, he found an hour-old text from his friend Nathan. "Did you bang Kaylee?" He scoffed, typed several letters, then deleted them. Although his ego was yelling for him to announce his prowess as God's gift to women, he buried the urge because he knew such an act wasn't worth the risk. He trusted Nathan, but only to a certain point. After all, Nathan was human like any other human. He was flawed with the potential to make mistakes. The idiot had the habit of getting drunk and allowing his mouth to run for miles, often leaking precious information, like the mole in a spy film. And life is long, with its twists and turns. Relationships can grow strong, but they can also turn sour. And there was always the risk of Nathan taking hostile action if fate was ever to pronounce them as enemies. Yes, betrayal could rear its vulgar head anywhere and at any time. He should know. James was the poster boy for betrayal. "Talk to you later," he replied under his breath. He scrolled through his apps until he came across the Uber icon. As he waited for the elevator, he scrolled through the photos of the half-nude university student. Kaylee was passed out on her bed. He had snapped the photos only moments before sneaking out of her apartment. He wanted to keep the images like a trophy, but he knew it wasn't smart. He'd always have the memories. The elevator door rang, the doors parted, and James entered. He stood inside a narrow box with timber-paneled walls. Above him were two stingy circles of light. The brass metal doors closed in front of him and displayed a distorted and unflattering reflection. He hit the button for the ground floor and the elevator rattled to life. As the elevator descended, he appraised every move he had made with Kaylee. Despite his initial reluctance to party with the boys, it had truly turned out to be a great night. His proud thoughts became marred by a dark truth. This was the first time he had laid this girl, but it was not the first time he'd been in this building. In a drunken and horny stupor, he had numbed any anxiety about returning to this place. He glanced up at the ceiling. In a corner, the black orb of a security camera observed him. The last time he had been in the elevator was in 1991, when he had been the age of 18 and the camera had not yet been installed. A suppressed memory stirred him and he saw the glassy eyes of Ingrid fret. He thought about the travel suitcase he'd take from her closet, how heavy it had been, dragging it through the building, how he pulled something in his lower back as he shifted the suitcase into the trunk of a hired car. That night, as he drove out of the city and towards the mountain ranges, his lungs were tight and his stomach twisted with the fear of getting caught. When he saw the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror, he nearly soiled his pants. As the police car swiftly gained ground behind him, he feared he would be in a jail cell by morning. The car drew closer and he could see the silhouettes of two officers. He thought about outrunning them. Was that even possible? He thought about ramming into them and running their car off the road, perhaps into a ditch, or even better, a steep cliff. There were plenty of cliffs within the next few miles. Or should he stop? Let them ask their questions. He should stop. There was no better alternative. But what if they asked to look inside the trunk? What if they already knew what he had done? This couldn't be where his story ended. He knew he was brilliant, admired by many and destined for greatness. He couldn't bear the thought of his image being tarnished. He heard jury announced guilty, he heard the rattling of chains. The threat of losing everything made him sob. The police siren sounded. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. He slowed down, pulled to the side of the road, and was about to stop when the police car passed him. James breathed a sigh of relief as the police car disappeared over the horizon. About 40 minutes into his journey, he was driving along a meandering road that cut through hill and brushland. He passed the reservoir before making a turn down a narrow dirt road. Overhead, tree branches reached out from each side, forming a tunnel. Here, the only source of visibility came from his headlights. 20 minutes in, he arrived at a clearing and pulled up to the edge of a swamp. He kept the engine running. After a cigarette, he got out and approached the back of the car. With a grunt, James heaved the suitcase out of the trunk. Through grass, mud, and rotting leaves, he dragged the suitcase. He cursed as something painfully popped inside his rotator cuff. Under the canopy of a willow tree, he stood at the edge of the swamp. He found a branch, used it to test the depth of the water, and was satisfied. He needed the suitcase to fill with water and sink properly, so he partially unzipped it. When it opened, he was given a view to Ingrid's arm. On the back of her hand was a tattoo, an M with an arrow tail. She had once told him it was the symbol for her astrological sign, Scorpio. As he gave the suitcase a final push, he watched it sink into the black water. He scoffed at a thought. "Now you're in your element," he said. "Bon voyage." The position indicator lit up the G as the elevator arrived at the ground floor. The doors did not part. He pressed the open button several times, but the doors remained still. He hit the ground floor button, but nothing happened. He was startled by a form reflected in the elevator door. It had only been there for a second, but he could have sworn that he saw a second person, a female, standing behind him. He spun around and, of course, there was no one there. He shook the feeling free, however. It was replaced by another unsettling thought. He had a new problem, one which posed a threat to the lifestyle he had so cunningly built. The clock was ticking. He had to get out of the city and into the suburbs, get home, showered, and into bed. His wife Linda was a nurse, and her 12-hour shift would be ending soon. He couldn't lose her. It wasn't that his wife was anything special, but she was a stepping stone on the road to him becoming king, his father-in-law. The fat bastard was on his deathbed, and very soon Linda would come into a glorious sum of money. It was highly important that he keep up appearances, even if he couldn't keep it up over her. Once more he pressed the open button. Nothing. He tried the call button. Nothing. He hit the alarm button, and what happened sent a chill down his spine. The alarm sounded with the ear-piercing scream of a woman in terror. The elevator trembled. The elevator screeched. The elevator fell. And it fell through impossible depths. Faster and faster, deeper and deeper. The pressure around him severely changed. His bones creaked and his lungs clamped tight. He tried to scream, but no sound would escape. As the elevator came to a sudden halt, and he felt as if his skull might burst through his face, he quelled the urge to vomit. Holding his stomach, he dropped to the floor and backed into the corner. He heard creaks of straining metal and kept his eyes on the doors. Instinct warned him that something was behind those doors. He didn't know exactly what was waiting for him on the outside, but he knew it was something sinister. He looked up at the black orb, wondering if anyone was monitoring him on the video camera. He got to his feet and waved. The lights of the elevator flickered. He felt something brush the hair on the back of his head, spun around to see nothing but his distorted reflection in the elevator doors. He glanced at his phone. The reception bars were empty. Nevertheless, he attempted to call Nathan. It was a failed attempt. All of a sudden, the song of Wolf and Man played from his cell phone. Startled and confused, he looked at the phone. The screen read, "Unknown caller." It occurred to him that maybe the building personnel were contacting him. No, wait. How would they have his number? He looked up at the black orb in the corner of the elevator. The phone continued to ring. Could it be a number from the hospital? Was his wife calling him? He waited another moment. The caller was not giving up, and he finally answered. "Hello?" Silence. "Is someone there?" He heard static. Actually, it was more like the faint sound of breathing. "Is this security? Look, I need help. I'm stuck in the elevator. Please get me out of here." James? With that one word, the hairs raised on the back of his neck. It was little more than a whisper, but he recognized the voice and told himself it was impossible. He pressed the speakerphone icon. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, the woman spoke again. "I'm going to tell her." "Who is this?" "I'm going to tell her about us." He stuttered before fully forming her name. Ingrid? "I'm going to tell her that I'm carrying your child." "It's not my... It wasn't my..." He trailed off. He glanced down to see his phone was dead. He looked towards the video camera and, with a scowl, he raised his middle finger. He wasn't certain a voyeur was present. All the same, he felt the weight of its scrutiny. He pressed the elevator buttons, he growled, he pounded on the elevator doors. He whimpered, "Let me out of here." And with those words, the elevator doors shot open and his jaw dropped when he saw what was beyond them. He stepped out and was hit by hot air, which left an acrid taste in his mouth. Before him was a hypogeum made from giant limestone blocks. Cracked pillars and crumbled walls obscured the view of dens and passageways. Dusty beams of light, their sources unknown, stretched vertically and horizontally here and there. In the distance, he could see a dark, rectangular object and cautiously moved towards it. As he drew closer, he discovered it was the suitcase, Ingrid's suitcase. He heard the elevator doors closing, spun around and ran towards them. It was too late. The doors had closed tight. The elevator had ascended, and to his horror, there was not one single button to push. He returned to the suitcase, opened it and found it empty. He caught movement in the corner of his eye. From a pillar, maybe 50 meters out, something was peering around the corner and observing him. "Hello? Is someone there?" The face of the observer moved out of sight. A shuffling sound caught his attention and he spun towards the direction of the source and was startled. What the hell? All of a sudden, the observer stood only several steps away. The woman wore a torn, filthy nightgown which hung off one shoulder, exposing one of her breasts. Rusty brown dreadlocks partially obscured her face and her head cocked unnaturally to one side. She raised a bony finger and pointed at James. His breath caught in his throat. The woman released an ear-piercing scream. All his instincts told him to run, but James stood frozen as the woman charged towards him, her movements stiff, as if affected by rigor mortis. Before James knew it, she was on him, her leathery, bare feet pressing into his sides, sharp fingernails digging into his shoulders. Her weight pulled him forward. They fell. He crashed on top of her. He broke free, rolling to the side, but she swiftly mounted him. She ground her pelvis against him, and it was painful. He felt more bone than flesh. Then she leaned in, revealing the gaunt, barely recognizable face of Ingrid Frett. Her blood-red eyes bulged as if they would explode all over him. She brought her mouth close to his lips. Her teeth were an ash gray and sickly yellow. He gagged as the stench of decay invaded his nostrils, and a putrid tongue slid deep into his mouth. In an attempt to push her face away, his fingers sunk through the skin of her cheeks, into the slimy space of her mouth. Her neck cracked loudly as he forced her head back. He cried in disgust as he broke free, got to his feet, and made a run for it, only allowing a hurried look. Ingrid wasn't chasing him. She lay on the ground, as still as a pile of bones. He didn't know where he was going, but he kept running and running through countless dens and passageways until he was completely lost. Should the elevator ever return to this subterranean level, should the doors burst open wide and welcome him, it didn't really matter, because he was so far away now and would never find his way back. He arrived at a place where the beams of light became rare and the walls closed in. He stepped on angular rock fragments and pebbles and narrowly avoided rolling his ankle several times. As he wandered, he remembered stories he had heard about people disappearing in the Paris catacombs. He pushed the thought aside, but it was replaced by the image of Ingrid, the coarse sensation of her swollen tongue and foul taste that lingered long after. He wanted whiskey and needed water. He desired a long, soothing shower. Beads of sweat steamed from his forehead. His dust-covered skin itched. He realized he might never again experience fresh air and sunlight. He thought about his wife. She really was a good woman, a rare breed. He wished he was with her in their cozy bed. He knew by now she would have arrived home and discovered his absence. James thought he heard his name being called. He turned with such a sharpness that he lost his footing. All of a sudden, he was on his back, sliding down a deep slope, caught in a landslide of pebbles and rushing towards the edge of a cliff. He rolled onto his stomach, and as the black void approached, he clawed desperately at the slippery surface. It was hopeless. He fell through the darkness. Then bones shattered. But it was not an immediate death. He lay, staring at the faint glow of light at the top of the cliff. He could feel no sensation from his neck down. He willed himself to move, but his mind no longer had control over his body. A shadow cut across the light, and James realized he wasn't going to die alone. There she stood, at the edge of the cliff. Head first and with apparent ease, Ingrid crawled down the cliff face, slowly, making her way towards him. Epilogue. Earlier that night, when he finally got rid of that annoying manager, Branko, the security guard, settled in the CCTV control room. He hated these 12-hour shifts. Nothing exciting ever happened. He gave his girlfriend a call and spoke to her for about an hour. That was followed by a couple of hours on his PlayStation Portable. Eventually, he fell asleep. Branko woke around 5:45 a.m. to discover all of the security monitors were dark. He turned them back on. All cameras appeared to be working just fine. Out of curiosity, he decided to check the footage. He scrolled through the last few hours and found the footage was blank. Odd, but he couldn't be bothered making anything of it. Before his shift ended, Branko patrolled the building and found nothing out of place. He returned to the control room and wrote up the night's report. All checks performed. No issues of concern. Going Down, written by Jacob Cordtz and read by Bob Reiff.